In 1900, the British Empire controlled a quarter of the planet. Its navy ruled the oceans. Its banks financed global trade. And its currency, the pound sterling, was the center of the financial world. 50 years later, the empire was collapsing. Colonies were leaving. The war had bankrupted Britain. America had become the new superpower, yet something strange happened. The pound didn't die immediately. Instead, Britain spent decades trying to save it. Welcome to Finverse Stories, where money, power, and history collide. And nothing is ever as simple as it looks. The era of sterling dominance. To understand how Britain tried to save the pound, you first have to understand just how dominant it once was. During the 19th century, Britain built something unprecedented, a global financial system centered on London. The Industrial Revolution had turned Britain into the world's manufacturing powerhouse. But its influence went far beyond factories and ships. British banks financed infrastructure projects from South America to Asia. Insurance markets in London underwrote global trade. Shipping routes connected British ports to every major market on Earth. And at the center of it all was sterling. By the late 1800s, most international trade was financed in pounds. If a merchant in Brazil wanted to import machinery from Germany, the transaction often passed through London banks and was settled in sterling. British financial institutions had become the intermediaries of global commerce. This wasn't accidental. It was supported by a powerful monetary system known as the gold standard. Under the gold standard, currencies were pegged to a fixed amount of gold. The pound, backed by Britain's credibility and its enormous gold reserves, became the anchor of the system. Governments and banks trusted sterling because they trusted London's financial discipline, but trust alone wasn't enough. The pound was also reinforced by the British Empire itself. By 1900, Britain controlled roughly a quarter of the planet's land and population. Colonies and dominions traded heavily with the mother country. Many held their reserves in sterling. Their financial institutions operated through London. Shipping, insurance, commodity trading, and international credit all flowed through the same hub. Empire and currency reinforced each other. Territorial power created financial influence. Financial influence strengthened the currency. And the strength of the currency made the empire easier to manage. It was a self-reinforcing system. If you wanted to understand the global economy at the start of the 20th century, you didn't look at Washington or Berlin. You looked at London. The shock that changed everything. But then came World War I. In 1914, Britain entered the war as the world's dominant financial power. By the time the war ended in 1918, that dominance had been severely damaged. War on an industrial scale is extraordinarily expensive. Armies must be fed, armed, transported, and supplied continuously. Ships, artillery, and munitions require enormous production capacity. Governments must mobilize entire economies to sustain the effort. Britain financed much of the war through borrowing. Government spending exploded. Debt surged. Gold reserves drained as payments flowed abroad for supplies and weapons. And most importantly, Britain began borrowing heavily from a rising financial power across the Atlantic, the United States, before the war. The United States had been a major economy, but not the central banker of the world. After the war, the situation was reversed. America emerged as the largest creditor nation on Earth. Financial gravity had begun shifting from London to New York. Britain had won the war militarily. But financially, the balance of power was changing. Churchill's tragic blunder. Faced with this new reality, Britain had a choice. It could accept that the world was changing and allow the pound to adjust naturally, or it could attempt to restore the old system. British policymakers chose the second option. In 1925, the British government made one of the most controversial monetary decisions in modern economic history. Winston Churchill, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, announced that Britain would return to the gold standard. At first glance, this sounded like a restoration of stability. The gold standard had once anchored the world's financial system. Returning to it seemed like a way to restore confidence in the pound, but there was a critical detail. Britain decided to return to gold at the same exchange rate that had existed before World War I. In other words, policymakers pretended that the financial damage of the war had never happened. This meant the pound was effectively overvalued. British goods became more expensive in international markets. Exports suffered. Industrial regions, particularly in northern England and Scotland, faced declining demand. Unemployment rose sharply. Factories closed. Mines struggled. Workers paid the price. The decision was controversial from the beginning. One of the loudest critics was the economist John Maynard Keynes. Keynes argued that restoring the old exchange rate ignored the economic reality Britain now faced. The country's productivity, competitiveness, and financial position had changed dramatically during the war. Trying to recreate the pre-war monetary order, he warned, would impose enormous strain on the domestic economy. He called the policy a tragic blunder. History would prove him largely correct. By prioritizing the prestige of the pound, Britain placed heavy pressure on its own industries and workers. Defending the currency meant suppressing wages, tightening monetary conditions, and maintaining a financial system that no longer matched the country's economic strength. But for British policymakers, the status of sterling was not just a technical matter. It was a symbol of global influence. If the pound lost its position at the center of international finance, Britain's global standing would decline with it. So they defended it. The great unraveling. For a while, the system held. But the global economy was becoming increasingly fragile. The late 1920s saw rising financial tensions across the world. Credit expanded rapidly. Stock markets boomed. And beneath the surface, structural imbalances were growing. Then in 1929, the system began to unravel. The Wall Street crash triggered a global economic contraction. Banks failed. Trade collapsed. Countries struggled to defend their currencies under the rigid constraints of the gold standard. Britain found itself under mounting pressure. Investors began losing confidence in sterling. Gold reserves were drained as capital flowed out of the country. Maintaining the fixed exchange rate required tightening monetary policy in the middle of a deepening economic downturn. It was an impossible situation. By 1931, the pressure had become unbearable. Britain abandoned the gold standard. The pound was allowed to float, and its value fell sharply. For a country that had once anchored the global monetary system, the decision was humiliating. It signaled that Britain could no longer maintain the rigid financial architecture that had defined the 19th century. At that moment, it would have been reasonable to expect the pound to collapse as a global currency. The empire was weakening. The gold standard was gone. The United States was rising. Yet something unexpected happened. Despite the crisis, the pound did not disappear from international finance. The sterling area empire by balance sheet instead. Britain began constructing a new system, designed to keep sterling alive, even as the empire that had sustained it began slowly disappearing. And the key to that strategy was something called the sterling area. Instead of relying purely on market confidence, Britain built the sterling area as a financial network that kept demand for the pound alive. At its peak, it included large parts of the British Empire and Commonwealth, countries across Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and Oceania. These economies were tied together by a shared financial framework centered on London. Members of the sterling area were expected to conduct much of their international trade using sterling. Their central banks held reserves in pounds. Foreign exchange transactions were cleared through London's banking system. In practical terms, this meant that large parts of the world continued using sterling, even as Britain's economic power weakened. It created a built-in demand for the currency, even if the British economy was struggling. The global system still needed pounds to function. This arrangement bought Britain something incredibly valuable: time. And it revealed an important truth about global finance. Currencies do not dominate simply because of national strength. They dominate because entire systems are built around them. Trade networks, banking systems, debt markets, and reserve holdings all create what economists sometimes call financial inertia. Once the infrastructure of global finance is built around a currency, replacing it becomes extremely difficult, even if the underlying power behind that currency is weakening. For Britain, the sterling area was essentially a financial version of empire. Territory was slowly slipping away. Colonies were beginning to push for independence. Political control was weakening. But inside the financial system, the empire still existed. Countries continued holding sterling reserves. Their trade continued flowing through London. Their financial institutions remained tied to British banks. In a very real sense, the empire survived inside balance sheets, even as it disappeared from maps. The seeds of instability at the system had a dangerous weakness. Sterling area countries were accumulating large reserves in pounds. These reserves represented claims on Britain's financial system, And those claims could eventually be converted into other currencies, particularly into the one currency that was rapidly becoming more powerful than sterling. The US dollar. This meant the entire structure contained the seeds of its own instability if confidence in the pound ever collapsed. Foreign governments holding sterling could rush to exchange those reserves for dollars. And Britain would face something terrifying, a global bank run. This vulnerability became painfully clear in 1947. By the end of World War II, Britain's financial position had deteriorated dramatically. The war had drained its resources, destroyed overseas investments, and left the country heavily indebted. The United States had provided enormous support during the conflict through the Lend-Lease program, shipments of weapons, equipment, food, and supplies that kept Britain fighting. But when the war ended, that support stopped. Britain suddenly had to finance itself again. In 1947, under pressure from the United States and the new post-war financial system, Britain agreed to make the pound convertible into dollars. In theory, this meant anyone holding sterling could freely exchange it for American currency. It sounded reasonable. In practice, it was disastrous. Within weeks, foreign governments and institutions began converting their sterling reserves into dollars. Confidence in Britain's ability to support the pound evaporated quickly. The outflows were enormous. Britain's dollar reserves began draining at an alarming pace. Within 5 weeks, the government had no choice but to suspend convertibility. The experiment had nearly destroyed the currency. What this moment revealed was brutal but simple. The pound was still widely used around the world, but the confidence that had once supported it was fading. Sterling survived not because it was unquestionably strong, but because the global financial system was still built around it. And dismantling that system would take time. The rise of the dollar World War II had already reshaped the global balance of power. The United States emerged from the war as the dominant industrial and financial power. Its economy had expanded during the conflict. Its factories had supplied the Allied war effort. Its gold reserves were enormous, and most importantly, America now held the position Britain once had. It was the world's largest creditor. In 1944, even before the war ended, representatives from 44 nations gathered in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design a new international monetary system. The result was a framework that would define global finance for decades. Under the Bretton Woods system, the US dollar became the central currency of international finance. It was pegged to gold, and other currencies were pegged to the dollar. In effect, the dollar replaced the pound as the anchor of the global monetary system. Britain accepted this reality. But accepting it did not mean surrendering overnight. Sterling continued playing an important role in global finance for years afterward. The sterling area still existed. Many countries continued holding reserves in pounds. The decline of a reserve currency rarely happens in a dramatic collapse. It happens slowly, gradually, over decades. The long decline throughout the 1950s and 1960s, Britain faced repeated currency pressures. Economic growth lagged behind other industrial powers. Trade deficits appeared. Confidence in sterling weakened. Each crisis forced policymakers to defend the currency again. And each defense became more difficult. Then came one of the most famous moments in modern British economic history. In 1967, the British government devalued the pound for a country that had once dominated the global financial system. It was another humiliating milestone. Prime Minister Harold Wilson addressed the nation and tried to reassure the public. "The pound in your pocket," he famously said, "has not been devalued. Economically speaking, that was optimistic. Devaluation means exactly what it sounds like. The currency is worth less in international markets. Imports become more expensive. Inflation pressures rise. People often feel the consequences, even if politicians try to soften the message. By the late 20th century, the pound had fully transitioned from global reserve currency to an important but secondary currency. The center of global finance had moved permanently from London to New York. The lesson of financial inertia. The story of the pound's decline reveals something extremely important about the nature of global money. Reserve currencies do not disappear overnight. They fade slowly because the financial system is built to resist sudden change. Trade contracts, banking networks, commodity markets, and sovereign debt markets all rely on existing infrastructure. Switching the entire system to a new currency is incredibly disruptive. So transitions take time. Britain delayed the fall of the pound by reshaping the financial system around it, first through empire, then through the sterling area. But eventually, Financial gravity followed economic reality. The United States had become the dominant industrial and financial power, and the dollar became the currency that reflected that power. What this means for today. The global financial system still revolves around a single currency. The US dollar dominates international trade, global reserves, commodity markets, and sovereign debt issuance. Energy is priced in dollars. Global banks clear transactions in dollars. Governments hold dollars as their primary reserves. In other words, much of the world still operates inside a dollar-based financial architecture. And that architecture creates the same financial inertia that once protected sterling, which raises a question many people are beginning to ask. If the geopolitical balance of power shifts in the future, what happens to the dollar? History suggests the answer will not be dramatic. Reserve currencies rarely collapse overnight. They decline through long transitions as new financial systems slowly replace old ones. That process can take decades. Britain experienced it firsthand. The pound did not die when the empire fell. It lingered, adapted, and gradually gave way to a new financial order. The deeper lesson is that currencies are never just money. They are instruments of geopolitical power. When a country dominates trade, finance, and global institutions, its currency becomes the backbone of the system. But when that dominance fades, the currency eventually follows. Not suddenly, but inevitably. History doesn't repeat. But if you don't understand it, it will crush you all the same. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.